Okay, so we're back and ready to really dive into the Black Dahlia.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks listening probably have some idea about this case. It's one of those that just stuck in people's minds.
Definitely. I mean, it's just so much more than a whodunit, It's really this story that's become like, part of Hollywood lore, really, and in true crime history.
Totally. And for good reason. The brutality, the mystery, the set. I mean, come on. It's got all the ingredients for I don't know, a true crime obsession that's lasted for what? Almost 80 years now?
Exactly.
Hmm.
So we're going to try and do this one justice today. We've got, a ton of different sources to draw from, newspaper articles from back in the day, books, police reports.
Even some interviews and documentaries with people who were involved in the original investigation.
Yeah, so we're going to try to piece together, the story as best we can and kind of explore why this case still has such a hold on us. What is it about the Black Dahlia that keeps people coming back to it?
I think that's the question, isn't it? It's like even when we think we know everything about it, there's always something else, some new theory, some new angle.
Right. So let's start right at the beginning. January 15th, 1947, Los Angeles. Picture a typical California morning, blue sky sunshine. This young mother, Betty Bersinger, is walking with her 3-year-old daughter through Lema Park.
Just a normal day, right? But then things take a very dark turn.
Yeah, they come across something truly horrifying in a vacant lot on South Norton Avenue. And at first glance, it's so disturbing that Betty thinks it's a store mannequin. It's a naked female body cut in half.
Severed right at the waist. And I'm talking surgically precise, not some, hack job.
Yeah, and the body was posed in a really deliberate way. Arms above her head, legs spread apart. Her intestines were actually tucked under her body. It was like something out of a nightmare.
And to make it even creepier, there was no blood at the scene. Not on the body, not on the ground.
Right, so investigators figured the killer cleaned the body somewhere else and then brought it to the lot and staged it.
Yeah, and that's what's so chilling, right? It wasn't just a murder. It was this orchestrated display. Almost like the killer wanted an audience.
Well, I mean, they practically left her on the sidewalk. It was so close to a busy street, someone was bound to find her.
And they did. It wasn't long before the news spread and crowds started gathering. Even hardened police officers were shocked by what they saw. And can you imagine being a reporter showing up to that scene?
It must have been absolutely insane. This was way before the 24-hour news cycle. But even back then, the press descended on the story.
They went crazy for it. It was front page news everywhere. And pretty quickly, the case became known as the Black Dahlia murder.
But before we get into that nickname, let's talk about the victim. Identifying her was actually surprisingly fast.
They got lucky in a way because the LAPD decided to involve the FBI right away. So they sent her fingerprints to Washington using this newfangled thing called sound photo. It basically let them transmit images over telephone lines. It was like an early fax machine.
Wow, that's pretty high tech for 1947.
Yeah, well, it turned out the FBI already had Elizabeth Short's fingerprints on file from a previous job application. So less than an hour after sending those prints, they had a match.
So they knew it was 22-year-old Elizabeth Short pretty quickly.
Yeah, but figuring out who she was and what led her to that vacant lot, that was a whole other story.
Right, so Elizabeth was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1924. She was the third of 5 daughters, and her childhood wasn't easy. Her dad lost his job in the Depression and just up and left the family when she was 6.
They thought he'd committed suicide for years. His car was found abandoned on a bridge. Can you imagine?
Oh my gosh. So her mom was suddenly a single mother raising 5 kids during the Depression. Talk about a tough break.
Yeah, and Elizabeth herself had some serious health problems. She had really bad asthma and bronchitis, and even needed lung surgery when she was just 15.
But then in 1942, she got this incredible news. Turns out her dad was alive and living in California.
Yeah, he just reappeared out of nowhere after more than a decade, sent her a letter apologizing for everything and asking her to come live with him.
Wow. So she went out to California hoping for a fresh start and some relief from her health problem.
Yeah, she was 18 at the time, and she moved to Vallejo to live with her dad. But things didn't really go as planned. They butted heads a lot, and she ended up moving out on her own.
And that's when she met this Army Air Force Major Wright, Matthew Gordon.
Yeah, she was working at a military base camp cook, and they fell in love, and he actually proposed to her while he was recovering from war injuries in the hospital.
Oh, that's kind of romantic, but also so sad because He died before they could get married. He was killed in a plane crash.
Yeah, it was just weeks before the war ended. You can imagine how devastating that was for Elizabeth.
It's like one tragedy after another in her life.
Mhm.
So she moved around a bit and finally ended up in Los Angeles in 1946.
Yeah, she was working as a waitress, trying to make ends meet, living in this tiny little apartment behind a nightclub. And there were these rumors going around that she was involved in prostitution.
Right? Like, she was using her looks to get by, which, I mean, we've seen some sources that say that, but there's really no hard evidence to support it.
Yeah, it's one of those things that gets repeated so often that people just assume it's true. But honestly, a lot of the details about Elizabeth's life are pretty murky.
Yeah, like the whole aspiring actress thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a good story, right?
Yeah.
Beautiful young woman comes to Hollywood with dreams of stardom, but ends up murdered. But there's no evidence she was ever actually trying to get into acting.
No screen credits, no headshots, nothing.
Yeah.
It's more likely that the newspapers just kind of ran with that angle because it fit the narrative they were trying to create.
Right, this image of this, naive small-town girl caught up in the dark side of Hollywood.
Eh.
It's a classic trope.
Exactly. And then there's a whole Black Dahlia nickname. Where'd that even come from?
That's a good question. It seems to have popped up pretty quickly after the murder. Some sources say it was the press who came up with it.
Maybe they got it from police officers who had heard it from people who knew Elizabeth. There's stories about her always wearing black dresses and black lace.
And of course, there's this hugely popular movie that had just come out, The Blue Dahlia. So maybe the name just kind of stuck because it was catchy and fit the whole dark and mysterious vibe of the case.
It's definitely more memorable than the Elizabeth Short murder.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But it also kind of speaks to the way the media sensationalized this whole thing. They were obsessed with the Black Dahlia.
Totally. And you see that even more clearly when you compare it to another murder that happened just a month later, the so-called lipstick murder.
Right. A woman named Jean French was killed in her apartment, and the killer wrote a message on her body using lipstick. And at first, some newspapers tried to tie it to the Black Dahlia case, even though there's no real connection.
Yeah, it was just this desperate attempt to keep the Black Dahlia story going because it was selling so many papers. They even misread the message on the body, thinking it said BD for Black Dahlia, when it probably actually said PD for Police Department.
Talk about reaching.
Yeah.
And then there's what the Los Angeles Examiner did to Elizabeth's mom. It's just despicable. They called her pretending she'd won a beauty contest just to get her to talk about Elizabeth, and then they told her about her daughter's murder.
Can you imagine? I mean, it's just so exploitative and insensitive, but that's how crazy the media frenzy was around this case. They didn't care who they hurt as long as they got the story.
So with all this attention, the LAPD was under a lot of pressure to solve the case, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And they actually put a lot of resources into it. They brought in the FBI, like we said, and they interviewed hundreds of people, chased down thousands of leads.
But it seemed like every time they thought they were getting close, they hit a dead end.
Yeah. And they had a lot of suspects, some more promising than others. The first guy they really focused on is this guy named Robert Manley.
Right. Red Manley. He was the last person to see Elizabeth alive. He'd given her a ride back from San Diego and dropped her off at a hotel in Hollywood.
So obviously he was at the top of their list, especially since he had a history of mental health issues and had been discharged from the Army for nervous breakdowns.
But he agreed to take 2 lie detector tests and passed both of them. Plus, he had a solid alibi for the time of the murder.
So Red Manley was cleared, but the case was far from solved. And then things got even weirder. The killer started sending letters to the press.
Right, just a few days after the murder, the Los Angeles Examiner got this phone call from someone claiming to be the killer.
And this guy was like super cocky. He basically complained about how the newspapers were covering the case and said they were getting the facts all wrong. And then he said he was going to send them some of Elizabeth's stuff to prove he was the real deal.
And he did. The next day, this package arrives at the Examiner with Elizabeth's birth certificate, business cards, photos, even her address book.
And on the cover of the address book, someone had written the name Mark Hansen.
Mark Hansen was this nightclub owner who'd let Elizabeth stay at his house a few times. So right away, he becomes a prime suspect.
Especially because he knew Elizabeth through his girlfriend, and they'd been seen together shortly before she disappeared.
Yeah, so the cops are really looking at Hansen, but then they get another break. They find Elizabeth's purse and one of her shoes on top of a trash can a few miles from where her body was found.
Red Manley actually identified the purse, but guess what? No fingerprints. The killer had wiped everything down with gasoline.
Wow, so even though he made this mistake of leaving the purse and shoe behind, he was still careful enough to not leave any prints.
Yeah, he was definitely trying to cover his tracks. And the letters didn't stop with that first package to the Examiner. More letters started showing up at different newspapers all over LA. Some of them were just taunting the police, but one of them actually offered to confess in exchange for a 10-year prison sentence.
Yeah, like, hey, just give me a light sentence and I'll tell you all about it. Obviously, the police didn't take him up on that offer.
Can you imagine? I mean, what kind of deal is that? But the lab confirmed that all those letters were written on the same kind of paper and used the same envelopes as the first package with Elizabeth's belongings. So it seemed pretty clear they were all from the same person.
So now you've got this massive media frenzy, a $10,000 reward being offered for information, and this killer who's basically toying with the police through the press. It must have been chaos.
Total chaos. The LAPD was flooded with tips and false confessions. People were coming out of the woodwork claiming to be the Black Dahlia killer. There was even this bizarre incident where someone left a pile of clothes on the beach with a note claiming to be Elizabeth's killer, but then they never found a body.
It was like everyone wanted to be a part of this case, even if it meant making stuff up.
Yeah, and all that noise made it really hard for the detectives to focus on the real leads. They were chasing their tails for months, but they did have one pretty strong theory. They believed that the killer had some medical knowledge.
Right, because of how cleanly Elizabeth's body was cut in half and all the other mutilations.
Exactly. It wasn't just some random act of violence. This was someone who knew what they were doing. So they started investigating doctors and medical students in the area, but they never found any solid evidence to connect any of them to the murder.
But there was one witness who might have actually seen the killer. This guy who lived near the vacant lot where Elizabeth's body was found told the police he'd seen a man standing near the lot on the night of the murder.
He described him as middle-aged, thin, average height, wearing a tan coat and a dark hat. And he was driving a light-colored 1935 sedan. Apparently, he saw the guy again a few minutes later, and the guy just sped off in his car.
So it's possible this guy actually interrupted the killer while he was still with the body.
Yeah, that's one theory. But again, it's just another piece of the puzzle in this incredibly complex and frustrating case. The LAPD had a huge list of suspects, like I said, over 200 by the time the case went to a grand jury, but they could never pin it on anyone.
So let's talk about some of the more well-known suspects. We've already talked about Red Manley, who was cleared. But what about Mark Hansen, the nightclub owner?
Yeah, well, they looked into him pretty hard because his name was in Elizabeth's address book and because he had given her a place to stay.
And there were rumors about him trying to pressure her into a sexual relationship, which she refused.
Right, and some people thought he might have been involved in her death because she rejected him.
Plus, there were stories about him being connected to some shady characters in L.A. and possibly using those connections to avoid scrutiny from the cops.
But ultimately, they never found enough evidence to charge him with anything.
Another interesting suspect was this guy, Leslie Dillon. He was a bellhop, but he'd also worked as a mortician's assistant, so he knew how to handle bodies.
Yeah, and he kind of inserted himself into the investigation by contacting this LAPD psychiatrist, Dr. J. Paul DeRiver. Dillon claimed he was writing a book about sadists and psychopaths and wanted to pick DeRiver's brain.
But during their conversations, Dillon started revealing all this really specific information about the Black Dahlia murder, and it just seemed too accurate to be a coincidence.
Yeah, DeRiver actually started to believe that Dillon was the killer and that he was just using this whole book thing as a cover to get close to the investigation.
So they arrested Dillon, but then things took another crazy turn.
Yeah, the cops in San Francisco got in touch with the LAPD and said they'd found a guy named Jeff Connors. It turned out Connors was a real person, and Dillon had mentioned him in his letters to DeRiver, claiming that Connors was the actual killer.
So Dillon was saying he was just an accomplice, but the cops couldn't find any real evidence linking Connors to the crime.
And Dillon had this alibi that placed him in San Francisco at the time of the murder, although they could never completely verify it.
So they had to let him go, but he remained a suspect for a long time.
Yeah, a lot of people still think he was involved, even though they could never prove it.
And since the police were so convinced that the killer had medical knowledge, they naturally looked at any doctor who'd been connected to Elizabeth. One of those was Dr. Patrick O'Reilly.
O'Reilly knew Elizabeth through Mark Hansen's nightclub, and he had this really disturbing history of violence. He'd actually been convicted of assault with a deadly weapon for brutally attacking his secretary.
So he definitely fit the profile of someone who could be capable of such a brutal crime. But again, they could never tie him directly to the murder.
And then there's the whole theory that maybe the Black Dahlia killer was the same person as the Cleveland torso murderer.
Right, because of the similarities in the way the victims were dismembered.
Exactly. Both cases involve these really gruesome mutilations, and they both happened within a few years of each other.
But again, there's no concrete evidence to link the two cases. It's just one of those theories that people keep coming back to because it's so intriguing.
And it's not the only one. There are all sorts of wild theories out there about who killed the Black Dahlia.
Yeah, some people think it was the gangster Bugsy Siegel or this actor Rawson Wells, but most of those theories are pretty far-fetched.
It's like everyone wants to solve this mystery, even if it means coming up with these really outlandish explanations.
Well, it's a mystery that's captured the imagination of people for generations. Even the detectives who worked on the original case were haunted by it.
Yeah, the last surviving detective, Ralph Asdell, who died in 2003, always said he believed they'd identified the killer, but just couldn't get enough evidence to convict him.
And Aggie Underwood, the famous crime reporter who covered the case, she also believed she knew who did it, but she never revealed the name.
She said the person was dead and it didn't matter anymore, but she never gave up hope that the case would be officially solved someday.
But it hasn't been. And these days, the most prominent suspect is actually the son of a doctor.
Yeah, you're talking about Steve Hodel. His dad was Dr. George Hodel, and Steve has spent years building a case against his own father.
He claims he found all this evidence in his dad's belongings, like photos of a woman who looks like Elizabeth Short, and letters that Steve says match the handwriting in the letters sent to the newspapers.
It's a pretty compelling case, but there's still a lot of debate about whether it's enough to definitively solve the Black Dahlia murder.
So even after all these years, we're still left with more questions than answers. Why did someone kill Elizabeth Short? What was the motive behind such a brutal and calculated crime? And who was the person responsible?
I think that's what keeps people so fascinated by this case. It's this puzzle that we can't seem to solve. It's like we need to know the answer, but the answer might not even exist anymore.
It's also about more than just the facts of the case, right? It's about how this one murder became this cultural touchstone, this symbol of Hollywood's dark side.
Yeah, and it's about how this young woman's life was cut tragically short and how her story became this legend that's been told and retold for generations. We may never know the full truth about the Black Dahlia, but the case continues to remind us of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most glamorous places, and how some mysteries might just stay with us forever.
And I think that's where we're going to leave it for today. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's so much more to explore about the Black Dahlia case. If you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to check out the sources we used for this episode. We'll link to them in the show notes, and let us know what you think. Do you have any theories about who killed Elizabeth Short, or why this case has had such a lasting impact on our culture?
Yeah, we always love hearing from you guys, so hit us up on social media or leave a comment on the website. And until next time, stay curious.
And keep digging.